Hi, welcome back to another episode of Leadership Lenses. I'm Barry Kislowitz, and this is our 15-minute podcast designed for Jewish school leaders, supporters, and anyone else who wants to improve Jewish education. Last week, we spoke about the idea of different stages or different perspectives that a head or principal might have on their board. We paralleled them somewhat facetiously, somewhat seriously, to the stages of grief, and we noted that some are in the stage of, I'm angry, I'm upset with the board, I don't want it to be here, it's messing with me, it's messing things up, why does it have to exist? Some are in more of a sort of pragmatic, okay, well, I'll deal with you, I'll give you what you want, you'll give me what we want, and that's somewhat parallel to that negotiation stage within the stages of grief. And again, as we said last week, it doesn't mean that you're in one of these stages all the time. You might go back and forth. Sometimes you might want to get rid of the board entirely. Other times you might be willing to play ball with them pragmatically on what they want to do. And then I suggested a third stage, which paralleled the stage of acceptance in our stages of grief. Now, acceptance doesn't mean like stage 2, well, I accept that the board is here. They're never going to change. They're never going to go away. Maybe even this particular board president is never going to change and never going to go away. You know, he'll be president for another 20 years. She'll be president or treasurer or vice president for much longer than I will be in the school. That's not the kind of acceptance that we're talking about in that final stage. What we're talking about in the final stage is understanding, accepting, integrating the idea that the board can theoretically contribute to your leadership of the school. That the board can fundamentally exercise leadership. And rather than being something you either have to avoid, bargain with, and make sure you don't get on the wrong side of, the board can actually be something that contributes and elevates the school both within your tenure as a leader and for many, many decades, literally decades to come, if we're doing this right. So I'm a big believer that we know beliefs and perceptions follow behaviors rather than the other way around. And so instead of saying, okay, we're going to wait till everybody's firmly in this perception of, I know the board can contribute to leadership, and then we'll talk about what to do, we're going to start by talking about what to do. Assuming you are in this mode, and maybe it's the first couple of weeks of school. Hopefully you've had a great opening board meeting. Everything's looking bright and sunny. If it's not, pretend it is for a couple of minutes. And we're going to try and explore what you would do, what you could do if you were taking this perspective of, hey, the board is part of the school leadership and they actually may have something unique, special, different, and really valuable to contribute. Now, I want to be clear again. I don't mean that they have that to contribute today. Right? I don't mean that your board is perfect. I know there are many boards that are very challenging. Just because you've even succeeded with a board in one school doesn't mean that you're guaranteed success in the next. And this is not entirely in your control. But at the same time, most of us came to this position, this leadership, from the stance and the background of education. And there's a couple of things that we believe as educators. Number one, we fundamentally believe that people can grow, learn, and develop. Now, I know some people may like to say children can grow, learn, and develop. Adults, what are you going to do? But I'm going to push back and say people are people no matter how small, no matter how old, and it might be a little bit more challenging, but there is the possibility that people can develop and that we can find people, if we don't have them now, who could grow and develop in this direction of providing not just oversight and not just something to deal with, but real leadership as a board. That's point one. Now, I know I haven't described what that leadership is. We'll get back to that. But point one is we believe that people, even adults, can change. Point number two, I want to borrow from William Glasser's choice theory, which essentially, and he applied this in a short book called Choice Theory in the Classroom, which essentially argues that when kids act out in class, when you have any quote unquote behavior problem, What's fundamentally happening is that a child has an unfulfilled need. And because you're not setting them up to fulfill that need and have it met as a teacher, they're going to meet it for themselves as a child. So what are the needs? There might be a need for power, a need for control, a need for attention, a need for engagement, entertainment. Any of these needs, you can see clearly how a kid, right, who might be sitting bored in a class where the teacher's lecturing will be much more entertained if they start causing trouble, will feel much more of a sense of power if they disrupt the class. And so Glasser's theory essentially says the best way to manage a classroom is for the teacher to figure out how to supply those needs of the children so the children aren't looking for their own way to fill those needs. So if you can provide lessons and a classroom environment that is engaging, empowering, stimulating, you'll have much better chance of having kids who are engaged rather than kids who are disengaging as an alternative to entertain themselves. Now, I know not everyone buys this in terms of the classrooms. I do. I've seen it work. I think that if we're honest about our experience as school leaders, we can point to teachers who do this and we understand what their classrooms are like and that their management and their classroom environment doesn't come from teacher exertion of power, but it comes from what they're building with the kids. I actually want to expand that in a way to our boards. Now, I don't mean necessarily that your board members are misbehaving in meetings. They might be. I've definitely seen that. But that's not the point. The point is we often have boards going awry. We have boards going off course, micromanaging, getting involved in things that are really not appropriate because they're operations, or getting involved in things inappropriately, or simply not engaging, right? Not wanting to show up for meetings, or you don't have the ability to find your next president, vice president, treasurer, etc., because it's not like people are running for this position, as someone was quoted in a board study back in, I believe, 2020 by Rossop Consulting. The board president is pretty much who lost the game of not it in a lot of places. And they're stuck here. So all of these phenomena, right? The disengaged board, the meddling board, the lack of board leadership, those are major issues that many of us have faced and are facing and will face. And there are many approaches to these that are very effective. What I want to suggest is something that at least I haven't heard elsewhere, which is the idea that the best classroom management is a good lesson, but apply that to boards. Why are boards meddling? Why are boards overreaching? Why do boards not attract people? Because fundamentally what we're asking of the boards usually is not leadership. What we're asking of the boards is management. Please make next year's budget, approve it, make it as close as possible to this year's budget. Please figure out how to allocate some of the raises to teachers we need, or please don't mess with the internal CFO's suggestions for that budget. Please go and make a whole bunch of fundraising asks and bring in money, even when it comes to supervising and evaluating the head, right? You're doing a oversight process. And if all you're doing is oversight, if the board gets together, and I actually just reviewed someone's board agenda for their first meeting of the year, went through the entire agenda, annotated, and said to them, like, so what is it you want the board to do in this meeting? And they looked back at me and said, like, the board doesn't need to do anything. I just want them to show up. And then I'm going to have 4 presentations that are shared with them. So that's great. But if you could theoretically record your entire board meeting in advance and just email it out as a video clip, then it's really hard to justify bringing a whole bunch of busy people as volunteers into the room. So what you need to do, if you want your board to engage and actually to get to that place where it's leading effectively, is first think about the question of, well, what does it mean for a board not just to manage, not just to have their fiduciary oversight, but to truly lead in partnership and in an appropriate balance with the head of school in a day school environment? What would that look like? And that question, unfortunately, I think is one that's rarely asked. We often ask who the next president will be. We often ask how to get the budget through. We often ask technical questions about committees and meeting times and things along those lines, all of which are important, but we know it's an exact parallel to teaching. Those questions are like the kids sitting down and doing a whole bunch of math homework exercises. They're necessary, but if you don't have any excitement, engagement, development, then nobody wants to do that all year, certainly not when they're grown volunteers who typically are very successful in their own professional, personal, and communal lives in many other spheres. So my push to you is whether or not you're at that stage of, hey, I understand the board and I appreciate that the board can bring this leadership. Maybe you're still at the stage of, as I heard from a mentor many years ago, my board's a bunch of jerks. My job is just to be at least as big a jerk as they are so that we balance things out. And he did not use the word jerks. I'm cleaning that up for our PG rating here. You might be thinking that, but the only way to change your perception is going to be to experiment. And I of course want you to experiment carefully. This is the board. It's not a class of 7th graders that you might be able to take a little bit more leeway with. You have to experiment carefully. But my proposal, my suggestion is that if you don't start asking these essential questions of what does board leadership look like in practice, real leadership, not just oversight. Where do we want our board to be at the end of the year? And in our key UBD fashion, if those of you picked up on some of those key words, essential questions, enduring understandings, in our key understanding by design fashion, think about the end first. Where do you want the board to be at the end of the year? And what would that look like? What would it look like? What evidence might we see? Might we see evidence such as a budget that's been crafted in line with our strategic priorities in a different way? We might see evidence about the kind of discussions the board is having around strategy and sense making and framing issues in a way that leverages their insight, their particular insight as insider outsiders, because they're not in the building every day. They're committed, they're devoted, they're hopefully all very wise and thoughtful individuals. And that really, by the way, I think is the number one characteristic. If you're filling your board with people who can give donations and that's why they're on the board, then you're not setting yourself up to go here. Those people may also be wonderfully wise, but you have to be ready to take advantage of their wisdom if you want to have your board lead. Ultimately, I think that's actually a way to generate a lot more funding. And if you start asking that and start defining what some of that evidence may look like, well, then you can get to the next stage of starting to build in your mind at least, and then slowly rolling it out with your lay partners, a sense of what the year looks like for the board, right? So there's a lot here, and with boards, there's always way more to talk about than we can. But let me just go over it really quickly. Number one, none of this is possible if you're either in a denial, avoidance, or a pragmatic tit-for-tat sort of, well, I'll get you to do this and you'll do that and I'll do this. Those approaches don't work with this next move with the board. But it's not that you have to fully be in that third accepting and integrating stage in order to do this. Doing some of these actions and behaviors will get you there. And how will they get you there? As in general, we know that actions influence our feelings much more than the reverse in many cases. Number two, my push is that we believe that people can grow, and we know what's true in the classroom based on Glasser's choice theory is that when we don't give you a great way to self-actualize, to implement, to work in a meaningful way, then you're going to find other ways to do things. So as a board member, that either means you disengage and do other things, you overengage and micromanage, or you do something else that is not helpful. And so rather than focusing our energy on teaching the board not to intervene, which is necessary, they should not be micromanaging. But instead of saying that and trying to teach the right practices, we have to do some of the right things with them. And we have to turn our approach to say, okay, board, we believe you can lead in a meaningful way. It's not just oversight. It's not just a rubber stamp, but it's meaningful leadership. And now we're going to think together about what that might look like, what evidence we might look to tell us that we're going in the right direction, and how we move in that direction. And then, again, my argument is, and I'd love you to test it out, let me know if it works. My argument is that if you enable your board to go in this direction of real leadership with you, you will see both a reduction in all those challenging, difficult behaviors, and over time, a greater and greater generative contribution to the leadership of the school. Try it out. Let me know how it goes. As always, you can reach me, Barry Kislowitz, at LinkedIn, Substack Leadership Lenses, or on our website, kislowitzconsulting.com.